He'd shot down 64 Allied planes and survived 3 years of air combat. When Americans told him their fighters had escorted bombers from Japan to Tokyo, he called them liars to their faces. Then they showed him the fuel tanks. August 1945. A Japanese naval air base on Kyushu. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top surviving aces, has just been captured after Japan's surrender. He spent the entire war shooting down American aircraft. He thinks he understands American planes. Good engines, tough construction, but limited range. Then an American intelligence officer starts asking him questions that make no sense. Questions about how Japanese pilots defended against fighter escorts over Tokyo. Sakai says that never happened. The Americans couldn't fly fighters that far. This is the story of what Japan's best pilots learned about American aircraft that shattered everything they thought they knew. Saburo Sakai was born in 1916 in Saga Prefecture, Japan. His family was poor but had samurai heritage. Sakai grew up hearing stories about his ancestors' honor and martial prowess. When he was old enough, he joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1933. He wanted to be a pilot, but becoming a naval aviator was incredibly difficult. The selection process was brutal. Thousands applied. Dozens were accepted. Sakai made it through. The training was harsh by design. Japan believed that suffering built character and capability. Trainees who couldn't handle the physical and mental pressure were washed out. Sakai endured. He graduated as a naval aviator in 1937 and was assigned to fighters. By 1938, he was flying combat missions in China. He got his first kill in 1939 and quickly proved himself as a skilled pilot. When the Pacific War started in December 1941, Sakai was an experienced combat pilot. He flew in the attack on the Philippines. He shot down American P-40 fighters and B-17 bombers. The early months of the war were a turkey shoot for experienced Japanese pilots like Sakai. American pilots in the Pacific were inexperienced and flying inferior aircraft. Japanese pilots had been combat tested in China. They had better aircraft and better training. The Zero fighter Sakai flew was faster, more maneuverable, and had longer range than anything the Americans had. Sakai's kill count climbed. By mid-1942, he had over 60 confirmed victories. He flew missions over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Rabaul. He shot down P-39s, P-40s, and Wildcats. American pilots learned to fear Japanese aces like Sakai. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. Japanese pilots used this advantage ruthlessly. But Sakai also saw troubling signs. American aircraft that got shot up would often limp home instead of going down. The Zero was lightly built for performance. A few hits could destroy it. American planes like the Wildcat and especially the P-40 could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. Sakai watched American planes fly away trailing smoke with large sections of their airframes shot up. They shouldn't have been able to fly, but they did. American pilots also seemed to have unlimited ammunition and fuel. They'd make multiple attack runs. They wouldn't break off when Sakai expected. Japanese pilots had to carefully manage their ammunition and fuel. Run out of either and you were dead. Americans seemed to fire freely and stay in combat longer. Sakai assumed this meant American pilots were wasteful and poorly disciplined. In August 1942, Sakai's war changed. During a mission over Guadalcanal, he was severely wounded. An American SBD Dauntless rear gunner hit him in the head. The bullet destroyed Sakai's right eye and caused severe head trauma. Sakai should have died. Instead, through incredible willpower and skill, he flew his damaged Zero 560 miles back to Rabaul. He was unconscious for much of the flight but somehow maintained enough awareness to reach base. Sakai survived but lost his right eye. He spent months recovering. The doctors said he'd never fly again. Sakai refused to accept this. He retrained himself to fly with one eye. By 1944, he was back in combat despite his disability, but the war had changed. American aircraft were better. American pilots were more experienced. Japanese air superiority was gone. Sakai flew defensive missions over Japan in 1945. By then, the situation was desperate. Japan was losing the air war badly. American bombers hit Japanese cities regularly. Japanese fighters tried to intercept but were overwhelmed by numbers and outclassed by newer American aircraft. Sakai shot down several B-29 bombers and their escort fighters, bringing his total to 64 confirmed kills. But these victories meant nothing strategically. For every American plane shot down, 10 more appeared. What confused Sakai was the range of American operations. B-29 bombers flying from the Mariana Islands could reach Japan. That made sense. Bombers had long range, but increasingly those bombers were escorted by American fighters, P-51 Mustangs. These fighters would appear over Tokyo, over Osaka, over Nagoya, hundreds of miles from any American base, fight Japanese interceptors, then fly back. This shouldn't have been possible. Sakai knew aircraft performance. Fighters had limited range because they needed to be fast and maneuverable. You couldn't have range and performance. It was a fundamental trade-off in aircraft design. Yet American P-51s were appearing deep over Japan, escorting bombers, fighting Japanese interceptors, then vanishing back toward their bases. Sakai and other Japanese pilots assumed the P-51s must be operating from carriers offshore. That was the only explanation. American carriers would approach close to Japan, launch fighters, then recover them after the mission. This was dangerous for the carriers but explained how fighters could reach Japan. Japanese intelligence tried to locate these carriers but never found them. Some Japanese pilots speculated that Americans had built secret air bases on small Pacific islands closer to Japan, maybe on Iwo Jima or Okinawa after those islands fell. This would reduce the distance P-51s had to fly. But even from Iwo Jima, Tokyo was over 700 miles away. No fighter could fly 700 miles to target, fight a battle burning fuel, then fly 700 miles back. The numbers didn't work. The mystery frustrated Japanese pilots and intelligence officers. Where were these P-51s coming from? How were they achieving these ranges? Some thought Americans had developed a new type of engine that was vastly more fuel efficient. Others thought the P-51s must be using some secret technology that Japan didn't know about. A few thought the whole thing was impossible and that American reports of fighter escorts over Japan were lies or exaggerations. Sakai believed the escorts must be operating from nearby carriers or secret bases. He couldn't imagine any other explanation. The alternative, that American fighters could fly 500-mile round trips from distant bases, was absurd. Aircraft design simply didn't allow for that kind of range in a fighter. It violated everything Sakai knew about aviation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Sakai was at his base on Kyushu. The announcement came as a shock even though most Japanese pilots knew the war was lost. Sakai had survived the entire war, which was nearly miraculous. Most of his fellow pilots from 1941 were dead. He was one of the very few aces who made it to the end. American occupation forces arrived at Sakai's base within days. Sakai and other pilots were ordered to cooperate with the Americans. There would be no further resistance. The war was over. Sakai complied, but he was wary. He expected harsh treatment. The Americans had every reason to hate Japanese pilots. Sakai had killed many American airmen. He wasn't sure what would happen to him. Instead of execution or imprisonment, Sakai was interviewed by American intelligence officers. They wanted to understand Japanese aviation, Japanese tactics, aircraft performance, pilot training. Sakai answered questions carefully. He gave technical information but avoided anything that might be used against other Japanese personnel. During one interview, an American officer asked Sakai about defensive tactics against fighter escorts over Japanese home islands. How did Japanese pilots respond when American fighters appeared over Tokyo? What tactics were used? How effective were they? Standard intelligence questions. Sakai answered that Japanese fighters tried to engage American bombers before the escorts could intervene. The escorts were the main problem. P-51s were fast and heavily armed. Japanese pilots avoided them when possible and focused on bombers. The American officer nodded and made notes. Then the officer asked a question that made Sakai angry. He asked how Japanese pilots felt about defending against P-51s that had flown all the way from Iwo Jima or even the Marianas. How did the knowledge that American fighters had such long range affect Japanese pilot morale? Sakai said that was nonsense. American propaganda. P-51s couldn't fly from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. That was over 1,500 miles round trip. No fighter had that range. The escorts must have been operating from carriers or secret bases much closer to targets. The American officer smiled and said no. The P-51s really had flown from Iwo Jima. Some missions were even flown from bases in the Marianas, over 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Sakai called him a liar, not angrily, just matter-of-factly. That was impossible. Aircraft design didn't allow for it. The American officer said he understood Sakai's skepticism. Then he asked if Sakai wanted to see a P-51, to examine it personally and understand how the range was achieved. Sakai said yes immediately. He wanted to see what trick the Americans were using, what secret technology or technique allowed these impossible ranges. The next day, American personnel brought Sakai to a nearby airfield where American aircraft were based. Several P-51 Mustangs were parked on the tarmac. Sakai had seen P-51s in combat, but only briefly during high-speed encounters. Now he could examine one up close. He walked around the aircraft slowly, studying every detail. The first thing Sakai noticed was the P-51's construction. It was substantially built, heavier than a Zero, thicker skin, stronger frame. This made it more resistant to damage but also heavier, which should have reduced range. Sakai looked at the engine. The Packard Merlin V1650, a powerful inline engine. Sakai knew this engine was more efficient than Japanese radial engines, but not so much more efficient that it could triple a fighter's range. The American officer escorting Sakai pointed to external tanks under the P-51's wings. Drop tanks. External fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering combat. Sakai knew about drop tanks. Japan used them too, but Japanese drop tanks were small and provided maybe 100–200 miles of additional range. The P-51's drop tanks were much larger. The officer explained that P-51s flying escort missions to Japan would carry multiple large drop tanks. 2 110-gallon tanks under the wings, and sometimes a 75-gallon tank under the fuselage. These external tanks gave the P-51 an additional 295 gallons of fuel beyond its internal tanks. Combined with the P-51's efficient cruise speed and the Merlin engine's fuel economy, this gave the aircraft incredible range. Sakai did the math in his head. The P-51 had about 180 gallons of internal fuel. With full external tanks, that was nearly 500 gallons total. At cruise speed, the Merlin engine consumed maybe 40–50 gallons per hour. That meant 10 hours of flight time. At cruise speed of about 350 miles per hour, that was 3,500 miles potential range. More than enough to fly from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back with time for combat. But Sakai spotted what he thought was a problem. He pointed to the drop tanks and said they would affect the aircraft's maneuverability and performance. You couldn't dogfight with those tanks attached. The American officer agreed. That's why they were drop tanks. When P-51s encountered Japanese fighters, they jettisoned the external tanks. The tanks would fall away, and the P-51 would be clean and maneuverable for combat. After the fight, the P-51s would fly home on internal fuel. This shocked Sakai. The Americans were throwing away fuel tanks, just dropping them. Each of those tanks cost money and resources to build, and Americans were discarding them every mission to give their fighters the range needed to escort bombers deep into Japan. It seemed wasteful, insane. But Sakai realized it worked. The disposable fuel tanks solved the range problem that had seemed unsolvable. Japan had considered similar approaches but rejected them as too expensive. Japanese industry couldn't afford to build fuel tanks just to throw them away. Every resource was precious. Everything had to be reused or salvaged. The idea of disposable tanks seemed like absurd waste, but Americans could afford it. They built so many fuel tanks that throwing them away didn't matter. The tanks were cheaper than losing bombers that weren't escorted. Sakai asked to see inside the P-51's cockpit. The American officer helped him climb up. Sakai sat in the pilot's seat and looked at the instruments. Everything was clearly labeled in English, which Sakai couldn't read well, but the layout was comprehensible. Fuel gauges, engine instruments, gun sight, radio. The cockpit was more spacious than a Zero's, better visibility, more comfortable for long missions. What struck Sakai was how everything seemed designed for pilot comfort and efficiency. The seat was adjustable. Controls were well positioned. The canopy gave excellent visibility. This was an aircraft designed for long-range escort missions where pilots might be in the cockpit for 6 or 7 hours. Japan's fighters were designed for short-range interception and air superiority. Pilot comfort was secondary to performance. But for escort missions, keeping pilots alert and comfortable over long flights was critical. The American officer explained more about P-51 operations. Missions to Japan would launch from Iwo Jima. The P-51s would climb to altitude and form up with B-29 bombers. They'd cruise at economical speeds to conserve fuel. Over Japan, if Japanese fighters attacked, the P-51s would jettison their drop tanks and engage. The Mustangs were faster than most Japanese fighters. They could choose when to fight and when to disengage. After driving off Japanese interceptors, the P-51s would resume escort duties and fly back to Iwo Jima. Sakai understood the tactics now. The P-51 wasn't trying to dogfight Japanese fighters. It was trying to keep Japanese fighters away from the bombers. The P-51's speed and heavy armament made it dangerous to approach. Japanese fighters that tried to attack bombers had to get past the P-51s first. Often, Japanese pilots would see the escorts and decide the risk wasn't worth it. Mission accomplished without firing a shot. This was fundamentally different from how Japan used fighters. Japanese fighters were optimized for dogfighting, for outturning opponents, for close-range combat. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter, but turn performance didn't matter if the enemy wouldn't dogfight. American pilots learned to avoid turning fights with Zeros. They'd use speed and altitude advantages to attack, then disengage before Zeros could respond. Japanese tactical advantages became irrelevant when Americans refused to fight on Japanese terms. Sakai also learned about American pilot training. New P-51 pilots received extensive training before entering combat, hundreds of hours of flight time, practice in formations, gunnery training, navigation training, instrument flying, emergency procedures. American pilots arrived at combat units well prepared. They could execute complex missions like long-range escort because they'd been trained for it. Japanese pilot training by 1945 had collapsed. New pilots received minimal training due to fuel shortages. They were sent to combat units barely able to fly their aircraft. They had no chance against experienced American pilots in superior aircraft. Japanese tactics depended on pilot skill and aircraft performance. When skill disappeared due to poor training, and performance was matched or exceeded by American aircraft, Japanese fighters became target practice. The American officer showed Sakai maintenance records for the P-51s. Sakai was shocked by how detailed they were. Every component had a life cycle. Everything was tracked. Replacement parts were abundant. If something broke, it was replaced immediately. Maintenance crews were well-trained and well-equipped. Aircraft that had problems were repaired or replaced quickly. Operational readiness rates were high because maintenance was prioritized. Japanese aircraft maintenance by 1945 was a nightmare. Spare parts were scarce. Maintenance crews were overworked and undersupplied. Aircraft that needed repairs often couldn't be fixed because parts weren't available. Operational readiness rates were low. Pilots were flying aircraft that were barely airworthy because there were no alternatives. Sakai spent several hours examining the P-51 and talking with the American officer. By the end, Sakai understood how Americans had achieved what seemed impossible. The P-51 Mustang was specifically designed as a long-range escort fighter. Everything about it, from the efficient Merlin engine to the aerodynamic design to the use of drop tanks, was optimized for range. Combined with American industrial capacity that could build thousands of P-51s and millions of disposable drop tanks, the result was a fighter that could escort bombers anywhere. But Sakai also understood something deeper. The P-51 represented a different philosophy of air warfare. Japanese fighters like the Zero were designed for air superiority through dogfighting superiority. American fighters like the P-51 were designed for mission accomplishment. The mission was to protect bombers. The P-51 did this through speed, altitude, and firepower rather than through dogfighting agility. Different goals led to different designs. Neither approach was wrong intrinsically, but in the context of the Pacific War, the American approach worked better. Japan needed to stop American bombers from destroying Japanese cities and industry. Japanese fighters couldn't stop them because they lacked the range to escort, lacked the speed to catch B-29s at high altitude, and lacked the numbers to overwhelm American escorts. American fighters could do everything they needed to do. They could fly anywhere, fight anyone, and protect the bombers. That's why America won the air war. A few days after examining the P-51, Sakai was invited to fly in an American aircraft, a two-seat trainer variant of a P-51 called a TP-51. An American pilot would fly from the front seat. Sakai would ride in the back seat as a passenger. The purpose was to let Sakai experience American aircraft performance firsthand. Sakai agreed immediately. He was curious and also missed flying. The flight was a revelation. The P-51 had power that Sakai had never experienced. The Merlin engine provided smooth, sustained power throughout the flight envelope. Acceleration was impressive. Climb rate was excellent. At altitude, the P-51 cruised effortlessly at speeds that would have strained a Zero. The controls were heavier than a Zero's but precise. Everything felt solid and predictable. The American pilot demonstrated various maneuvers, rolls, loops, high-speed dives. The P-51 handled well despite being heavier than Japanese fighters. It wasn't as nimble in turns as a Zero, but it didn't need to be. The P-51's advantages were in straight-line speed, dive performance, and zoom climbs, tactics that let American pilots control engagement timing. During the flight, the pilot flew a simulated escort mission profile. They climbed to 25,000 feet and cruised at economical speed. The pilot explained through the intercom that this was how P-51s would cruise to Japan, conserving fuel, maintaining formation with bombers, watching for threats. At this altitude and speed, the P-51 could fly for hours. Sakai understood viscerally now what he'd only understood intellectually before. The P-51 could really do these missions. The range wasn't a trick or American propaganda. It was real capability built into the aircraft design. Japan had never built anything like this because Japan had different design priorities and lacked the industrial capacity to waste resources on features like disposable drop tanks. After they landed, Sakai thanked the pilot for the flight. He admitted that he'd been wrong about American fighters. He'd underestimated their capabilities because he judged them by Japanese standards. The Zero was designed for short-range air superiority. The P-51 was designed for long-range escort. Different missions, different designs. Both were good at what they were designed for. But in the Pacific War, long-range escort was more important than dogfighting superiority. Sakai also met some American pilots who'd flown combat missions over Japan. These pilots respected Sakai as an ace. They asked him about Japanese tactics and aircraft. Sakai asked them about their experiences flying escort missions. One pilot described a mission to Tokyo, 7 hours in the cockpit, flying through weather, navigating over open ocean, finding the bomber stream, fighting off Japanese interceptors. Then flying back, worried about fuel, hopping to see Iwo Jima before the fuel gauges hit empty. The American pilot said the missions were exhausting, not because of combat, which was brief, but because of the length. 7 hours is a long time to be strapped in a cockpit, wearing an oxygen mask, staying alert. Some pilots fell asleep on the return flight, which was dangerous, but they did it because it worked. The bombers got through. Japanese cities were destroyed. The war was won from the air as much as on the ground or sea. Sakai realized that American pilots were tired heroes too. They weren't supermen. They were professionals doing a difficult job, just like Japanese pilots. The difference wasn't courage or skill. It was resources and systems. American pilots had better aircraft, better training, better logistics, better everything. They won because their system was better designed for modern industrial warfare. This understanding changed how Sakai thought about the war. Japan hadn't lost because Japanese pilots were cowards or fools. Japan lost because Japanese industrial and economic capacity couldn't match American capacity. Japanese pilots did everything possible with what they had, but what they had wasn't enough. No amount of skill or courage could overcome systemic disadvantages in production, logistics, and technology. Sakai began participating in U.S. intelligence debriefings more actively. He explained Japanese air tactics. He described Japanese pilot training. He discussed Japanese aircraft capabilities and limitations. He helped Americans understand how Japanese pilots thought and fought. This information was valuable for historical records and for understanding air combat lessons from the war. In return, Americans shared information with Sakai about their own operations. He learned about American training programs that produced thousands of pilots, about American aircraft factories that built tens of thousands of planes, about American logistics systems that supported operations across the Pacific. The scale was staggering compared to Japanese efforts. One American officer showed Sakai production statistics. In 1944, America produced over 40,000 fighters. Japan produced about 6,000. America produced over 16,000 bombers. Japan produced less than 2,000. These numbers explained everything. No matter how skilled Japanese pilots were, they couldn't overcome a 10-1 numerical disadvantage. Especially when American pilots were also becoming skilled in flying aircraft that were equal or superior to Japanese aircraft. Sakai also learned about American aircraft development during the war. The progression from P-40 to P-51, each generation better than the last, faster, longer range, better armament, better all around. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft development had stagnated. The Zero was excellent in 1941 but obsolete by 1945. Japan developed new aircraft but couldn't produce them in meaningful numbers. American aircraft development and production both continued through the war. Japan could only do one or the other, and production was prioritized with obsolete designs. The fundamental lesson was clear. Modern war is won by systems, not by heroes. Individual aces like Sakai could shoot down dozens of enemies, but if the enemy kept coming with unlimited numbers and better equipment, the aces would eventually die and the war would be lost. Japan's strategy depended on fighting spirit and tactical superiority, overcoming material disadvantages. This strategy failed. America's strategy depended on building overwhelming material superiority that made tactical superiority irrelevant. This strategy succeeded. Saburo Sakai's journey from skeptical ace to understanding how P-51s achieved their range reveals important truths about the Pacific Air War. Japanese pilots weren't inferior to American pilots. Early in the war, Japanese pilots were more experienced and better trained. Japanese aircraft like the Zero had performance advantages over American fighters, but these advantages were temporary and tactical. They didn't address strategic realities. The strategic reality was that America had vastly greater industrial capacity than Japan. America could produce more aircraft, train more pilots, and sustain operations at a scale Japan couldn't match. When the war became a battle of attrition, Japan was doomed. Every loss was permanent or barely replaceable. Every American loss was replaced quickly, often with improved equipment. The P-51 Mustang exemplified American advantages. It was designed specifically for long-range escort, the mission that would win the air war over Japan. It incorporated advanced technology like the Merlin engine and aerodynamic refinements. It used innovative concepts like disposable drop tanks that Japan couldn't afford. And it was produced in vast numbers, over 15,000 total, which ensured that losses didn't matter. Japanese pilots' disbelief that P-51s could fly from Iwo Jima to Tokyo showed how different Japanese and American approaches were. Japanese designers couldn't imagine building fighters with that range, because it would require sacrifices in other areas or expensive solutions like disposable tanks. American designers could imagine it because American industry could afford whatever was necessary to make it work. The disposable drop tank concept particularly symbolized the difference. Japan had to conserve everything. Drop tanks would be made from metal that was scarce. Throwing them away seemed insane. America had abundant resources. Drop tanks could be built by the thousands. Throwing them away was more efficient than trying to recover and reuse them. This philosophy extended to everything. American aircraft that were damaged were often scrapped rather than repaired if repair was time-consuming. Japan repaired everything because replacements weren't available. Sakai's recognition that American pilots were also just professionals doing a difficult job humanized the enemy for him. During the war, Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as cowards who wouldn't fight bravely. Meeting American pilots who'd flown 7-hour missions to Tokyo, fighting through Japanese defenses, showed that Americans were brave and professional. They just had better equipment and support. The air war over Japan in 1945 was one-sided not because Japanese pilots gave up, but because the numbers and capabilities were impossibly lopsided. Japanese fighters attacking B-29 formations faced not only the bombers' defensive guns, but also swarms of P-51 escorts. Even if a Japanese pilot was skilled enough to shoot down a bomber, he had to survive the escorts first. Most didn't. The few who did became aces like Sakai, but there weren't enough of them to change outcomes. For Sakai personally, understanding why Japan lost helped him process the defeat. It wasn't that Japanese pilots had failed. They'd fought bravely and skillfully. It was that the system had failed. Japanese leadership had started a war against an enemy with overwhelming economic advantages. Tactical victories early in the war had masked strategic impossibility. By the time Japan's leadership realized they couldn't win, it was too late. Millions had died for a cause that was doomed from the start. After the war, Sakai worked various jobs. He eventually became an instructor, teaching young Japanese about aviation and about the war. He always emphasized that individual courage and skill mattered, but systems and resources mattered more. Japan couldn't win a war of attrition against America and should never have tried. This lesson, learned through painful experience, was something Sakai wanted future generations to understand. Sakai wrote a memoir called Samurai. That became one of the most famous personal accounts of air combat in the Pacific War. In it, he described his experiences and his evolution from confident ace to understanding the realities of modern warfare. The book became popular in both Japan and America because it humanized both sides and explained the war from a Japanese pilot's perspective. Sakai lived until 2000, dying at age 84. He remained interested in aviation throughout his life. He met with American veterans multiple times, including some pilots he'd fought against. These meetings were cordial. Former enemies could respect each other's service once the war was long over. Sakai particularly wanted to meet P-51 pilots to thank them for teaching him about their aircraft. The lesson about the drop tanks and long-range capability had stuck with him for decades. The story of Japanese pilots learning about P-51 range and capability through direct examination after the war shows how propaganda and limited information shaped perceptions during the war. Japanese pilots couldn't understand how P-51s reached Japan because they didn't know about the drop tanks or the full capabilities of American design and production. They assumed it was impossible based on their own experience with Japanese aircraft. Learning the truth required seeing American aircraft and systems up close. This pattern repeated across many areas. Japanese soldiers and pilots thought they understood American capabilities based on early war experience, but American capabilities evolved rapidly. New aircraft, new tactics, vastly increased production. Japanese perceptions lagged behind reality. By the time Japanese personnel understood what they were facing, it was too late to change the outcome. The lesson Sakai learned about the P-51 was really a lesson about modern warfare. Wars between industrial nations are won by whoever can produce the most and the best equipment, train the most personnel, and sustain operations longest. Individual heroics and tactical superiority matter in battles, but wars are won by systems. America had better systems than Japan. That's why America won. Not because American pilots were braver or more skilled, but because American industry and logistics were overwhelmingly superior. Watch the next video to see what else shocked Japanese pilots about American power.